bigcal, and welcome to my world. Today is another recent video games pickups video, and today's one is themed around wrestling games. 20 new wrestling games to add to my collection. And if you haven't seen my video before this one, there'll be a link somewhere. YouTube always changes how you can do links, but yeah, I did a video on a Kickstarter book that I got after almost 8 years. This one, to be precise, Wrestling with Pixels, and it details every wrestling game ever made, basically, up until a certain point in time. I think it sort of finishes at 2017, 2018, just because of when it was written, then time waiting to be published, yeah. So I'm going to be using this to help me show off some of my recent video game pickups based on wrestling games. So we'll put that book down there, and let's get started. The first game here is Pro Wrestling for the Game Boy, and this is the Japanese cartridge. If you were to get this in Europe or America, it would be called HAL Wrestling, which I do own, and it is essentially Pro Wrestling for the NES put onto the Game Boy. Unfortunately, it doesn't translate that well. Pro Wrestling on the NES, the best NES wrestling game in my opinion. Really, really fun, really good for the time that it came out, and how, I don't really want to say complex because it's not, but compared to the other wrestling games on the system, it is complex. It's got a fun mechanics and gameplay, yeah. Sadly, didn't really translate that well to the Game Boy, but pretty cool to have, and I genuinely didn't realise that this was supposed to be a port of the NES version, even though it was called Pro Wrestling, because there are a number of games all called Pro Wrestling that are not related to each other. Like there's the Master System one, nothing like the NES version at all. So yeah, Pro Wrestling / HAL Wrestling. So that's cool to own. Next we have WCW World Championship Wrestling for the NES. Lighting. Yeah, and this was called Superstar Pro Wrestling, I believe, in Japan. And yeah, obviously it's taken that game and just put the WCW license on it, so we got the WCW Wrestlers. It was the first WCW wrestling game ever made, I believe. Yeah, it's got a decent roster, but the sort of main appeal of this game over, especially the WWF ones, is that you can customise your wrestler's moveset before you go into a match. So, you know, you can choose a suplex or a pile driver, you know, hip toss or a body slam or whatever. So wrestlers don't just have the same boring generic moves, and you can also change them for every time you play. So that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, it's not quite as fun as, say, Pro Wrestling on the NES. Gotta keep bringing that one up. But yeah, it's not a bad attempt, and it's definitely more fun than the WWF games on the system. I'll give it that. So, WCW World Championship Wrestling. Now for Super Fire Pro Wrestling Queen Special on the Super Famicom, the Japanese game. It is, of course, a Fire Pro Wrestling game, you know, where the basics combat system is timing. You moving close to your opponent, you automatically grapple, and you have to push the button faster than your opponent. And you also have to make sure you start off using light attacks, and then once you wear them down you can use medium and then heavy. Really fun system. It's been basically the same since the early days to now. And this one, of course, is an all-female roster from I forget what promotion in Japan. I don't know if it's just the female roster from like New Japan or All Japan, or if it's an actual all-female promotion. I can't quite remember. But yeah, it's Fire Pro, just with a female roster. Fire Pro! You play it, it's fun. So yeah, Queen Special. Very fun, very fun. WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game for the Super Nintendo. This got a bunch of console releases. The main one that I played growing up was the PlayStation 1, which is probably the best version outside of the arcade, which I actually got to play recently in an actual arcade. My first time ever. Really, really fun. Had a blast. Yeah, so it's kind of like Mortal Kombat, made by Acclaim, or at least published it. I think Midway had something to do with it. maybe. Gets confusing with who owns what, and yeah. Basically, you got your digitised wrestlers, and it plays similar to a Mortal Kombat game, but inside of wrestling rings. You got a bit of extra 3D movement. And yeah, wrestlers have really, really crazy moves, like the Undertaker can slam you over the head with a literal tombstone. He can shoot out some weird ghost vapours as his own sort of like Hadouken type move. Really, really fun. The Super Nintendo version plays well, but has a smaller roster than some of the other versions. Yeah, it's just fun. The PS1 version's still the one I would go with, but the Super Nintendo port of it, pretty good. Astral Bout 2! Already on the first one, that was more of a wrestling game in a traditional sense. This one goes through more of a fighting style game, one-on-one fighting with wrestling mixed in. Think the Capcom game, what's it called? I can't remember the name of it. Yeah, you know what I mean, don't you? The Super Nintendo Capcom wrestling fighting hybrid game, whatever the hell it was called. It's kind of similar to that. It uses the Real Promotion rings, which was sort of an almost a shooty fighting thing, or was it fake shoot fighting, real shoot fighting? Yeah. It's not bad. I prefer more traditionally wrestling games, but yeah, it does the whole hybrid thing really, really well with wrestling and basic fighting. So, Astral Bout 2. Yeah, pretty cool to have on the Super Famicom. And again, for the Super Famicom, this one is, totally don't need help pronouncing it, All Japan Pro Wrestling Dash Sankai Saikyu Tag. I've likely butchered that to death. Very sorry, Japanese people. It did get a North American release, at least, to come out in PAL, I don't remember, but Natsumi Championship Wrestling. That's basically what the game is. It's just the Japanese version. Looks really, really good, I think. Nice, colourful sprites and things like that. The gameplay, I never really enjoyed it as much. A lot of Super Famicom games really did sort of utilise the Fire Pro style controls, but a lot of them kind of failed at it. Didn't quite get it. This was one that just doesn't quite get it, unfortunately, but it's not too bad. They even released it on the Wii U, the Virtual Console, and I don't know if it's come out on the Switch or not, but yeah. So you can play it with some more modern systems, but it's not one you need to run out and try, to be quite honest with you. Hybrid Wrestler. There is more to the title, but again, Japanese don't want to butcher it. It uses the guy from Pancrase Wrestling, Funaki something or other. Can't think of his name off the top of my head. But yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Tenru wrestling game that came out. We got the action on the top and then sort of commentary on the bottom. And this one kind of, and again another sort of literally hybrid wrestling kind of between the arcadey style fighting-y as well as Fire Pro mix. And yeah, it doesn't get it quite right, but it is better than the Tenru game, I will say that. It's not too bad, but definitely not one of the Super Famicom wrestling games I would typically recommend. But worth it for the collection for me, because I must have them all. Shinnippon Pro Wrestling 95 Tokyo Dome Battle. Think I got that right. Yeah, there were multiple games of this in the series. I think this one was the last one on the Super Nintendo, well, Super Famicom at least. And again, not really the best. If you're going to go with Super Famicom wrestling games, you can't really go wrong with the Fire Pro series. All these others, you got different promotions and different rosters and things, and that's cool as hell when they're officially licensed. But none of them really get the gameplay quite right. And sadly, this is just another one that doesn't quite get it right. If you play around for a bit, learn the controls, you can get used to it and have some fun, but you just wish you were playing a Fire Pro wrestling game instead, truth be told. For the N64 in Japan, Shinnippon Pro Wrestling Toucan Road, I think it's called, Burning Spirits. Something like that, anyway. Yeah, so it's on the N64 now, I think there was another version on another system. This one has fewer wrestlers on it than the other version. but it is still very fun to play. It's got a grappling system, and it's very good that the game tells you what to do next with the controls on screen. So you get in a particular situation, it's like, hey, press this button combination and you'll do this move. It's written in Japanese, but the buttons are there in English, thankfully. Yeah, so there is some fun to be had with this one. Again, like a lot of the Super Famicom games, you wish you were playing Fire Pro Wrestling. When you're playing this on the N64, you'll wish you were playing a certain handful of other wrestling games. But pretty cool to have the collection. I'd never heard of it before until I randomly came across it on eBay or whatever and picked it up for nice and cheap for the N64. Yeah, so my N64 wrestling game collection is slowly growing. Only a few more to go, I believe. Japanese Sega Saturn now, we have All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua, aka Virtua Fighter characters, and this is pretty fun. It's got a nice, easy system to get used to with the controls. Yeah, you can just go in and do some nice grapple moves and strikes and things, and pretty fun to play. Yeah, and a nice, very unique crossover with All Japan and, is it All Japan or New Japan, sorry? Yep, just double checking, All Japan and Virtua, so you got some Virtua Fighter characters in there. Yeah, don't know who, I'm guessing Wolf and Jeffrey characters. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with the Virtua Fighter series, never been a fan. I'm not a big fan of fighting games, I'll go for wrestling games. Yeah, so it's cool to have some unique characters in a licensed game like this, well before WWE were adding the Terminator into their wrestling games and crap like that. So, yeah, Sega Saturn, Japanese. I don't own a Saturn, so I do have to emulate this, but yeah, it's nice to add to the collection. Japanese exclusive PS1 wrestling game, a revival of Champion Wrestler. Champion Wrestler. It was originally an arcade game, like the late 80s, early 90s or something, and they brought a newer version over it onto the PlayStation 1. And, again, really fun. It plays like a Fire Pro Wrestling game. So, you have that, except it's Champion Wrestler, and it's fun, yeah. It's Fire Pro Wrestling. Essentially, you just have to get used to the specific timing for this one. Once you do, you can go out and have some matches and have an absolute blast. So I was pretty happy finding this one out. It was, again, one that I'd never actually heard of until I randomly spotted it on eBay or whatever, as sometimes just happens. So, yeah. Don't think it's licensed in any way, but then again, some of the guys on the cover literally look like wrestlers. You got a guy who looks like Sid, he looks like Sting, looks like Ricky Steamboat. Don't think he's licensed, but yeah, really fun game. Good Fire Pro alternative for the PlayStation 1. Move on now to the GameCube and a Japanese version of a game. It is Kinnikuman 2 New Generation versus Legend. Now, basically the Ultimate Muscle game. This one is available in English, but it was only released in North America, and getting it here in England for the GameCube, very expensive. Japanese version of it, cheap! Yeah, so very happy with this one. Ultimate Muscle. I love these little Japanese cases. They're so nice. You've got little cardboard boxes and you've got a tiny little case. The disc just fits in there. You know, the instruction manual and things. Yeah, very fun. The game, very easy to just pick up and play. I had no idea what the controls were. I went in and I was having a blast hitting moves and things. You know, it's very over the top, almost in a WWE All-Stars way, especially some of the finishing moves where you get, uppercut and knocked up in the air like 50 feet and there's all these special effects going on, and it's just a blast. I would very much like the English version of the game, but for now I will have to settle for the cheaper Japanese version. And thankfully I can play it because I've had a freeloader disc for the GameCube for years now. Never had a reason to use it until now. Moving over to the PlayStation 2, we have Fire Pro Wrestling Returns. but the Japanese version. I do have the PAL version, which at one point was pretty rare because it only got released in certain countries in PAL region. We didn't get a big full release like North America did, so getting the specific PAL version was difficult and expensive. It cost me £38 back in the day when I bought it, and I had to import it from a guy in Portugal. Yeah, but I do own that one, but now I also own the Japanese version. Nice cool little cover. Yep, and it's Fire Pro Wrestling Returns. You know, often considered one of the best Fire Pro Wrestling games. I haven't put as much time into it as I would like, so I can't really comment on that, but it's a Fire Pro Wrestling game. They're pretty much all good. Except for that one. You know which one. We don't talk about that one. We have AllStar Pro Wrestling 2 and AllStar Pro Wrestling 3 for the PlayStation 2, Japanese exclusives. The first one was an interesting idea with a very complicated system of controls. Thankfully they have refined it for the sequel, and even more so for the threequel. And what we end up with is two pretty fun Japanese exclusive wrestling games with massive rosters, tons of customization, and fun gameplay. So yeah, I haven't put too much time into these at the moment, sadly, but yeah, definitely games that I want to go to and just play through like crazy. So yeah, pretty good pickups now on all three of the AllStar Pro Wrestling games on the PlayStation 2. And lastly for the PlayStation 2 we have these two games. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce them because I can't. Yeah, so I'm just not going to. We have this one first, and it's a pachinko game. Why? I mean, I can understand, you know, Japan, they like pachinko machines, real life ones, but turning it into a video game and just sticking wrestler on the front? Why? And then we have this game over here. It's a puzzle game. Just a basic, you know, sort of, you know, 3-match thing, but with wrestlers. Kind of like, you know, Street Fighter puzzle, but with wrestlers. And just as odd. Yeah, so we have these two non-wrestling wrestling games, essentially. They are in there for the collection, of course, and yes, they are indeed detailed in the Wrestling with Pixels book, but I bought these before I got the book, so yeah, and it turns out there are a couple more of these. Which means I have to buy some more of these. Great. You want to know what's a crap wrestling game? This. Legends of Wrestling 2 on the original Xbox. I own 1, 2 and 3 on the PS2 I believe already, but you know, now I'm getting to the point where, okay, I'll pick up the console variants of them all, so yep, started to get them on the Xbox. This was such a disappointing series of games when they came out because the rosters are so good. I mean, you get modern WWE games now with huge, you know, rosters with legends on them. Back in the day, though, you only had a select few, and there were still a lot of guys that weren't in the games because they were on bad terms with WWE probably, or they had a deal with TNA maybe at the time, or they were working in Japan. These games brought so many guys together from, you know, the 80s and early 90s that I was a huge fan of. But the gameplay is awful in these games. Just awful. Even after reading the instruction book and learning what to do, it doesn't really help. I just never got to grips with how these work, how they play. Such a shame because graphically, pretty good. And like I said, the rosters are just amazing. But really, really bad gameplay, sadly. But yeah, I own it now on the Xbox as well, so I think I've still got the first one and the third one now to buy on the Xbox as well. I think there were some GameCube versions maybe. Oh joy! moving on to the PC. A physical PC game. I know, crazy. And that is Federation Wrestling. It's an M-Dicky game. And if you know anything about M-Dicky games, you know exactly what this is. They're just not that good. They aren't. I know lots of people love them, and the idea of them is great. With they kind of all sort of look and play similar to the old N64/PS1 wrestling games, but they just don't play as well. It's such a shame because there's tons of great ideas in them. They just never work as well as you would want them to. I can't believe how disappointed I was when I got this game in the post, put it in my PC, installed it, and was able to play it on a Windows 10 machine. Why couldn't it have just not worked on a modern system? Why did I have to be allowed to play it? Oh, but, you know, it's an interesting one for the collection, especially a physical PC wrestling game. Not really going to get many of those these days, I don't think. So, yeah. Game collection. And the 20th game that I'm showing off here is a pretty interesting one. So this particular game had a console release on multi-platform. I own two of them, I think. I think I own the Wii version and the PS3 version. Or the PS2 version of the PS3 version. I own, yeah. And then there was a DS version, which is incredibly rare here in the UK because I don't think it came out here. It came out in America. However, while looking this one up, I found out there was a PSP release of it. Literally shocked me, had no idea, but here it is. TNA Cross the Line. Yeah, PSP release of it. And this one, it's not particularly rare, it's just, I don't think many people really want it, so it goes for a decent enough price. I got it for pretty cheap, so I was thankful for that, but yeah, it's the TNA game on a PSP. Baffling, yeah. It's fine, you know, I probably got to grips with the controls a bit more with playing on this than I have done on the other versions. I kind of put a bit more time into it, but I've just never really liked it. And plus you've just got a tiddly, tiny small roster and so few options. It feels like half a game. It really does. If we'd got Impact 2 or whatever, Impact Cross the Line, Impact 2, hopefully they would have done a lot better and, increased the roster, the match types, worked on the grapple system and things and made it better. But instead we ended up with just this version, which is kind of like a tech demo of what the sequel could have been. And yeah, it just doesn't do it for me. But it's an interesting one for the collection, so I'm pretty happy with that. And there we go, 20 brand new wrestling games for my wrestling game collection, and some information with help with Wrestling with Pixels, aka the Wrestling Game Bible. Oh. Yeah, so I'm going to continue looking through this and seeing what games I don't own and looking out for them and seeing which ones I can pick up for nice and cheap to do another Wrestling Games Pickups video at some point in the future. So, I'm bigcal. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the wrestling games I got today. Let me know if there's any particular, really good ones that people don't really talk about, so I can pick them up down in the comments below. And I'll see you again next time.